After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? You are the most ungrateful person I have ever met." Those words cut through the holiday dinner atmosphere like a knife, silencing the clinking of silverware and casual conversation. My stepmom, Diane, stood at the head of the table, her face flushed with anger, perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at me. Behind her, the twinkling Christmas tree lights seemed to mock the tension that had instantly filled the room. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The irony was almost enough to make me laugh. Almost. The thing about family dinners at my dad and stepmom's suburban Atlanta home is that they always start the same way, with the appearance of perfection. Diane meticulously sets the table, with the Williams-Sonoma dinnerware she insists on using for special occasions, which somehow includes any time I visit. My father, Thomas Anderson, sits at the opposite end, usually buried in his phone until the food arrives, occasionally looking up to offer a distracted smile or nod. That Thursday evening was no different. I'd arrived exactly at 7 p.m., arriving. Even 5 minutes late would trigger a series of passive-aggressive comments about my inability to manage time like an adult. I brought a bottle of Diane's favorite Cabernet, which she accepted with her trademark tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Marshall, how thoughtful," she said, examining the label with a critical eye. "Not the vintage I usually prefer, but it will do." I was 28 years old, with a master's degree in finance and a promising career at Berenson Capital Management. Yet somehow, in this house, I was perpetually 16, the moody teenager who had disrupted Diane's perfect new marriage to my father 12 years ago. My father emerged from his home office when dinner was served, clapping me awkwardly on the shoulder as he passed. "Good to see you, son. How's work going with all those numbers and whatnot?" "It's good, Dad. We just closed a major portfolio restructuring that." "That's great," he interrupted, already reaching for his phone as it buzzed. "Let me just check this email real quick." Diane carried in a roast with roasted potatoes, her specialty that she reminded everyone took hours of preparation. My stepsister, Melanie, trailed behind with a bowl of salad, offering me a genuine smile, the only one I'd receive all evening. At 25, she had always tried to bridge the gap between me and her mother, a thankless position I never envied. "Marshall was just telling me about work," my father said, as he finally put down his phone and began carving the roast. "Oh?" Diane's eyebrows rose. "Still at that same company? I thought by now you'd be somewhere more established." I took a sip of water, swallowing the retort that rose to my throat. Berenson Capital was one of the top boutique investment firms in the Southeast, but Diane had decided years ago that unless I worked for a household name like Goldman Sachs, my career was somehow lacking. "Actually, I've been promoted twice in the past year," I said, accepting the plate Melanie passed to me with a grateful nod. "I'm managing our emerging markets portfolio now." "That sounds impressive," Melanie offered. "What does that actually entail?" Before I could answer, Diane cut in. "Speaking of money, Thomas, did you call about refinancing the mortgage like I asked? These interest rates are killing us." And just like that, the conversation shifted away. This was our familiar dance. My achievements minimized, then promptly forgotten as Diane redirected to matters she deemed more important. Usually, I let it go, having learned long ago that seeking approval in this house was a fool's errand. But something felt different this time. Perhaps it was the stress of the past months, knowing what I knew about their financial situation. Perhaps it was simply years of accumulated slights finally reaching critical mass. Whatever the reason, I decided to push back, gently. "Actually, interest rates have stabilized recently," I said. "It might not be the best time to refinance depending on your current terms." My father looked up, mildly surprised I'd re-entered a conversation that had clearly been meant to exclude me. Diane's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, Marshall, when you own a home of your own instead of renting that downtown apartment. Perhaps your financial opinions might carry more weight. I took another bite of food, chewing slowly. The apartment she dismissed was a penthouse overlooking Piedmont Park that I'd purchased last year, though I'd never corrected her assumption that I rented. Somehow my property ownership felt like information that would be weaponized rather than celebrated. "How's Mom doing?" Melanie asked, clearly attempting to diffuse the tension. "I saw on Instagram she was in Barcelona last month. Another landmine. My mother had remarried a successful restaurateur 5 years ago, and now enjoyed a life of travel that Diane seemed to take as a personal affront." "She's great," I said simply. "She and Greg are enjoying early retirement." "Must be nice," Diane muttered. "Some of us still have to work for a living." My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Did you catch the Falcons game last weekend? That fourth quarter was something else." The familiar pivot to sports, my father's refuge whenever emotional waters got too deep. I played along, discussing player statistics and season prospects, while Diane silently fumed at being sidelined in the conversation. The evening might have continued in this vein of superficial pleasantries and undercurrent tensions, if not for Melanie's innocent question during dessert. "Marshall, are you coming to Aspen with us for New Year's? Mom found this amazing chalet online." I paused, fork halfway to my mouth. I didn't know about any Aspen trip. "Oh," Melanie glanced at her mother. "I thought, weren't you going to ask him, Mom?" Diane dabbed at her lips with a napkin, avoiding eye contact. I wasn't sure if Marshall would want to join a family vacation, given how busy he is with work. The translation was clear. I hadn't been invited, and Diane hadn't planned to invite me. "Actually, I have the week off," I said, setting down my orc. "It sounds great." My father perked up. "That would be excellent. We could get some skiing in, like we used to when you were a kid." A flash of genuine connection, rare enough to catch me off guard. My father and I had indeed skied together before the divorce, before Diane, before everything complicated. For a moment, I glimpsed the man who had taught me to parallel on Vermont slopes, laughing when I tumbled into snowdrifts. Diane's smile remained fixed, but her knuckles whitened around her wineglass. "Well, the chalet only has 3 bedrooms, and the master suite is obviously for Thomas and me. Melanie will take the 2nd bedroom, which leaves—" "I can sleep on the sofa," I offered, though I already sensed where this was heading. "It's a very exclusive rental," Diane continued, as though I hadn't spoken. "We've already put down a substantial deposit. Adding another person would change the terms." "I'm happy to chip in for my share," I said. Diane laughed lightly, the sound like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "That's sweet, Marshall. But this is a premium property. The total is just over $12,000 for the week." The implication hung in the air. Surely I couldn't afford that. If she only knew. "I can manage my portion," I said calmly. "About 3,000, right?" Something flashed in Diane's eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, at having her assumption challenged. But before she could respond, my father's phone rang. He checked the screen and frowned. "It's Bill Thompson," he said, rising from the table. "I need to take this." "Excuse me." As he left the room, an uncomfortable silence descended. I could sense Diane recalculating, trying to find another reason to exclude me without seeming overtly hostile. "I'm not sure the booking can be modified this late," she finally said. "But I'll check." Melanie beamed. "This will be fun. We can hit the slopes together, Marshall. I've gotten much better since we last skied." I smiled at her enthusiasm. "Looking forward to it." Diane stood abruptly, gathering plates with more force than necessary. "Melanie, help me clear the table." "Marshall, you're the guest. You can relax." Another of her tactics, emphasizing my outsider status under the guise of hospitality. As they disappeared into the kitchen, I heard the murmur of heated whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. Classic Diane. She would now be explaining to Melanie why my inclusion was problematic, rewriting the narrative in real time. Father returned, his expression troubled. "Sorry about that. Work issue." "On Thanksgiving?" I asked. He sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "The Thompson account is in trouble. Nothing for you to worry about." But I did worry. Bill Thompson was my father's oldest client and closest friend. His architecture firm had been with my father's consulting business from the beginning. If there were problems there, it suggested larger issues. "Is everything okay with the business, Dad?" I asked carefully. A shadow crossed his face. "Just a temporary cash flow problem. We'll sort it out. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." Before I could probe further, Diane swept back into the dining room, a forced brightness in her voice. "Who's ready for coffee? I've made a pumpkin spice blend specially for tonight." My father's expression closed off. The brief window of vulnerability sealed shut. I recognized the pattern. Any meaningful conversation would now be diverted to safer topics. I accepted the coffee Diane brought, listening as she detailed the effort she'd gone to in preparing the holiday meal, the difficulty in finding organic cranberries, and the special ordering of the heritage turkey. As she spoke, I studied with my father. New lines had formed around his eyes since I'd seen him last month. His custom-tailored shirt seems looser around the collar. Small details that might mean nothing, or might confirm what I'd accidentally discovered 3 months ago. It had been a routine matter at work. One of our financial analysts had flagged an unusual pattern in a credit report during a standard background check for a potential client, Thomas Anderson, my father. Normally, I wouldn't have been involved, but the analyst knew we were related and brought it directly to me, unsure how to proceed. What I saw shocked me. My father, who had always projected financial stability and success, was drowning in debt. Home equity loans, maxed-out credit cards, personal loans with alarming interest rates. His consulting business was showing classic signs of cash flow distress: late vendor payments, tax liens, deferred maintenance expenses. The most troubling part was the timing. The financial hemorrhaging had begun approximately 3 years ago, accelerating rapidly in the last 18 months. It coincided precisely with Diane's increased spending: the kitchen remodel, the luxury SUV, the country club membership, the designer wardrobe, the essential trips to high-end spas. I had said nothing at the time, respecting my father's privacy. Instead, I quietly began investigating, using my professional expertise and connections to piece together the full picture. What emerged was alarming. My father was roughly $430,000 in debt, with creditors beginning to circle. His business, once thriving, was barely staying afloat, as he diverted business funds to maintain their lifestyle. Most concerning was the second mortgage he'd taken out on the house, my childhood home, where we now sat drinking pumpkin spice coffee and pretending everything was fine. Unless something changed dramatically, he was roughly 6 months from bankruptcy. "Marshall, did you hear me?" Diane's sharp voice pulled me from my thoughts. "I'm sorry, what was that?" She sighed dramatically. "I asked if you'd be bringing anyone to Aspen. A girlfriend, perhaps? Though I suppose we'd need to know soon to adjust the arrangements." "No, just me," I replied, used to her not-so-subtle digs about my single status. "Still focusing on your career?" she asked with false sympathy. "I suppose relationships do take real emotional availability." My father frowned. "Diane, Marshall's personal life is his business." A rare defense from my father, which seemed to catch Diane off guard. She recovered quickly. "I'm just concerned. 30 is approaching quickly, and establishing a family takes planning." "I'm 28, I reminded her, "and quite happy with my life as it is." Her dismissive wave said everything her words didn't. My happiness was irrelevant if it didn't conform to her vision of appropriate adult milestones. "Melanie has been seeing the youngest Peterson boy," Diane continued. shifting to her favorite subject. His family owns half the commercial real estate in Buckhead. That's nice, I said neutrally, catching Melanie's eye roll behind her mother's back. We're just getting to know each other, Mom, Melanie clarified. It's not serious. Well, it could be, with the right encouragement, Diane replied pointedly. The Petersons are exactly the kind of connection that builds a secure future. I wondered if my father recognized the irony. His wife pushing Melanie towards strategic relationships for financial security, while his own finances crumbled beneath their feet. If he did, his expression revealed nothing. The evening continued. Its predictable course, more subtle digs at my career, my apartment, my lifestyle, interspersed with effusive praise for Melanie's accomplishments at the public relations firm, where Diane had secured her a position through connections. By the time I stood to leave, the familiar weight of familial disappointment had settled on my shoulders. Yet beneath it was something new, resolve. The decision I'd been contemplating for weeks had crystallized during those uncomfortable hours. Thank you for dinner, I said, accepting Diane's perfunctory cheek kiss. Don't be a stranger, my father said, walking me to the door. And let us know about Aspen. In the brief moment when Diane was out of earshot, retrieving my coat, I asked quietly, Dad, is everything really okay? With work, I mean? A flicker of something. Fear? Crossed his face before his businessman's mask returned. Just the usual ups and downs, son. Nothing to worry about. The lie hung between us, another in the long collection of things we pretended not to see. As I drove home to my downtown penthouse, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, confirming instructions I'd given the previous week. The second was to my financial advisor at Berenson, authorizing a significant transfer. By morning, the process would be complete. I would have paid off my father and Diane's debts in their entirety. The second mortgage, the credit cards, the tax liens, all of it. Nearly $500,000 from my investments and savings, transferred anonymously through a complex series of transactions that would make the source untraceable. They would never know it was me. That was essential to the plan. My father's pride would never allow him to accept such help from his son, and Diane would rather drown than acknowledge that my financial success exceeded their carefully maintained facade. Instead, they would receive a simple notification from each creditor, balances paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. A financial miracle just in time for the holidays. I pulled into the parking garage beneath my building, smiling slightly at what I imagined. Their reactions would be relief for my father, certainly. And Diane? Perhaps she would attribute it to my father's business genius, a sudden turnaround she could boast about at her next country club luncheon. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly everything would unravel, or that Diane's next words to me would be an accusation of ingratitude that would change our family forever. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I was sorting through quarterly reports in my office when my phone lit up with my father's name. Unusual. Our communications typically followed a predictable pattern: obligatory holiday gatherings, occasional texts about sports scores, and the rare birthday call. Spontaneous mid-afternoon conversations weren't part of the routine. "Dad?" I answered, setting aside the Goldman Sachs prospectus I'd been reviewing. "Marshall." His voice carried an unfamiliar lightness. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course. Everything okay?" A pause, then a laugh that sounded almost giddy. "More than okay. Something incredible has happened." I swiveled my chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the Atlanta skyline shimmer in the December sunshine. "Oh? I don't even know how to explain it." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Someone paid off our debts, all of them." I kept my tone carefully neutral. "What do you mean, all of them?" "Everything. The second mortgage, the credit cards, the business loans. Even the tax lien. I started getting notifications yesterday. At first, I thought it was some kind of scam or mistake, but I've confirmed with each creditor. The balances have been zeroed out. Wow, Dad. That's incredible. I allowed genuine warmth to fill my voice. Any idea who would do something like that? Not a clue. He sounded bewildered. I've racked my brain trying to think of someone with both the means and motivation. Bill Thompson crossed my mind. We've been friends for 30 years, but even he couldn't manage something of this magnitude, Debt had been substantial. $427,120 to be exact. Not an impossible sum for someone of my financial standing, especially after some particularly successful investments over the past 5 years, but certainly significant enough to notice its absence from my portfolio. Could it be some kind of program? I suggested. Debt forgiveness through a financial institution or charity? That's what Diane suggested, but these weren't targeted programs. These were private payments made to specific creditors, all within a 24-hour period. Whoever did this knew exactly what we owed and to whom. I heard the unasked question in his voice. Did you have something to do with this? But he wouldn't directly ask. That would mean acknowledging he'd been in financial trouble severe enough to require intervention, something his pride would never allow. Well, whoever it was, they've given you quite a gift, I said. A miracle is more like it. His voice caught slightly. Marshall, things were worse than I let on. Much worse. This admission, however vague, was unprecedented. My father never discussed financial struggles, viewing them as personal failures rather than the complex circumstances they often were. I suspected things might be tight, I offered, giving him room to share without revealing my knowledge. A heavy sigh traveled through the phone. Tight doesn't begin to cover it. We were weeks away from losing everything. The house, the business, all of it. I've been lying awake every night trying to figure out how to tell Diane we needed to sell the house. I could imagine that conversation. Diane's carefully constructed social image relied heavily on their Tudor-style home in the prestigious Brookhaven neighborhood, with its manicured lawn and magazine-worthy interior she frequently showcased on her Instagram account. That would have been difficult, I acknowledged. How's she taking the news about the debt clearance? My father's tone shifted. She's processing it differently than I am. She sees it as confirmation that we deserve good things, that the universe recognizes her contributions to various charities and causes. Of course she did. Diane's monthly charitable contributions, primarily attending lavish fundraising galas that did more for her social status than any actual cause, were another source of financial strain I'd identified in my investigation. And you? How are you processing it? I asked. A long pause followed. With gratitude and humility, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. And a determination not to waste this second chance. Something in his tone, a genuine vulnerability I hadn't heard since childhood, made my throat tighten. This was why I'd done it. Not for Diane and her social aspirations, but for the father who'd once taught me to ski, who'd cheered at my little league games, who'd somehow gotten lost along the way. That sounds like a healthy perspective, I managed. It's made me think about a lot of things differently, he continued. Life priorities, relationships, including ours, Marshall. My breath caught. What do you mean? I haven't been the father you deserved these past years. I've been distracted, absent even when I'm physically present. That's going to change. A knock at my office door saved me from having to formulate a response through the sudden lump in my throat. My assistant, Kim, gestured apologetically that my next appointment had arrived. Dad, I appreciate that, but I need to go. Client meeting. Can we continue this conversation soon? Of course. Actually, why don't you come for dinner this weekend? Just the two of us. Diane's flying to Phoenix for her college roommate's birthday celebration. Dinner without Diane's watchful presence. Another unprecedented development. I'd like that, I said sincerely. Saturday? Perfect. And Marshall? Thank you for being patient with me all these years. After we disconnected, I sat staring at the phone, unexpectedly moved. The anonymity of my gift had been essential to my plan, but I hadn't anticipated how it might create space for this kind of overture from my father. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope for our relationship. That flicker was extinguished precisely 43 hours later. Friday afternoon, I was wrapping up a client call when my phone vibrated with Melanie's name. "Hey there," I answered, expecting our usual lighthearted chit-chat. "Marshall." Her voice was tight with tension. "You need to come to the house. Now." I sat up straighter. "What's happened? Is Dad okay?" "Dad's fine. Physically, at least." She lowered her voice. "Mom's on the warpath. She's somehow convinced herself that you had something to do with the financial situation." "What financial situation? The debt being paid off?" "No. Before that?" Melanie sounded exhausted. "She's telling everyone who'll listen that you sabotaged Dad's business relationships because you've always been jealous of their success." The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. "That's ridiculous. Why would she even think that? She went through Dad's office yesterday. Something about looking for insurance documents. She found some emails from clients who pulled their business over the past year. One mentioned getting better offers from younger firms with more innovative approaches. And somehow that translates to me sabotaging them? In Mom's mind, yes. She's connecting dots that don't exist, claiming you used your position at Berenson to poach Dad's clients or badmouth his business." "That's insane," I said flatly. "I work in portfolio management for private clients. Our firms don't even compete in the same space. I know that. Dad knows that. But Mom's built this whole narrative, and now she's demanding a family meeting to address your betrayal. Dad's trying to reason with her, but you know how she gets once she's committed to a version of events." I pinched the bridge of my nose, feeling a headache forming. "When is this ambush scheduled?" "She wants you here at 7. "Marshall, I'm sorry. I tried to tell her she's being irrational, but it's not your responsibility to manage her, Mel. I'll handle it." After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair, contemplating my options. I could refuse to participate in Diane's drama. I could call my father directly and clarify the situation. I could show up with documentation proving I'd had nothing to do with his business losses. Or I could use this confrontation to finally address the dysfunctional family dynamics we'd all been tiptoeing around for years. The rational choice would be to avoid the conflict entirely. But something in me, perhaps the same impulse that had led me to pay off their debts, pushed me toward confrontation rather than avoidance. At precisely 6:58 p.m., I pulled into their driveway. The house was ablaze with lights, including the rarely used formal living room where Diane entertained guests she wanted to impress. A theatrical setting for the drama she'd orchestrated. Melanie met me at the door, her expression apologetic. "She's been practicing her speech all afternoon," she whispered as she took my coat. "It's gotten more elaborate with each iteration." "Where's Dad?" "In his study. He tried to talk her down earlier and they had a huge fight. He's been holed up in there since." "Wonderful." I followed Melanie into the living room, where Diane sat perched on the edge of the velvet settee she'd imported from some European estate sale. Her posture was rigid, hands clasped in her lap like a principal awaiting a delinquent student. "Marshall." Her greeting was arctic. "Thank you for joining us for this important family discussion." I chose a seat directly across from her rather than the far corner where I usually positioned myself during family gatherings. "Melanie mentioned you had concerns about Dad's business. I'm happy to clear up any misunderstandings." Her eyes narrowed at my calm tone. She'd expected defensiveness, perhaps even guilt. My composure clearly disrupted her planned narrative. "Misunderstandings?" She gave a brittle laugh. "Is that what you call systematically undermining your father's business? Using your connections to steal his clients? That's not something I've done, I stated firmly. My professional work doesn't intersect with Dad's consulting business in any way. Then how do you explain this? She thrust a printed email toward me. Hamilton Technologies was your father's client for 8 years before suddenly jumping ship 3 months ago. Their CFO specifically mentions getting guidance from younger financial advisors about restructuring their consulting relationships. I scanned the email, immediately grasping the misinterpretation. This doesn't reference me or Berenson Capital. Younger financial advisors likely refers to their new in-house financial team. Hamilton Technologies went through a major restructuring after their last funding round. They brought most of their previously outsourced functions in-house. A convenient explanation, Diane scoffed. A factual one. This information is publicly available in their quarterly disclosures. The sound of my father's study door opening interrupted our exchange. He appeared in the doorway, looking weary and rumpled, so unlike the polished image he typically maintained. "That's enough, Diane," he said quietly. "I told you this accusation was baseless." She swiveled toward him, color rising in her cheeks. "You're defending him? After everything we've been through because of the business downturn?" The business downturn had nothing to do with Marshall, my father stated firmly. It was a combination of factors: market shifts, my failure to innovate quickly enough, and yes, our personal financial decisions. The last point landed like a grenade in the immaculate living room. Diane flinched visibly. Our financial decisions were perfectly reasonable for people of our standing, she insisted. My father sighed heavily, moving to sit beside Melanie on the sofa. No, they weren't. The country club membership, the kitchen remodel, the trips, the new car. None of it was reasonable given our actual financial situation. I watched, fascinated. In 12 years, I'd never heard my father directly contradict Diane about their lifestyle choices. "This isn't about our spending," Diane deflected, turning back to me. "This is about Marshall's resentment and sabotage." "Mom." "Stop," Melanie interjected. "This is crazy. Marshall has done nothing wrong." "Stay out of this, Melanie," Diane snapped. "You don't understand how family businesses work." "Actually," I said calmly, "this is exactly about your spending, Diane, not my non-existent sabotage." Her eyes flashed. "How dare you blame me for Thomas's business challenges?" "I'm not blaming you for his business challenges. I'm stating a fact about how your lifestyle choices affected their financial stability." "What would you know about our finances?" she demanded. I hesitated, glancing at my father. His expression was unreadable, but he gave me a slight nod, permission to continue. "I know that before your debts were mysteriously paid off, you were approximately $427,120 in debt," I said quietly. "I know the second mortgage on this house was taken out primarily to cover personal expenses, not business investments. I know Dad has been using business capital to maintain the lifestyle you've become accustomed to, which is why his company has been struggling with operational costs." The color drained from Diane's face. "How could you possibly—" "I work in finance. Diane, analyzing financial situations is literally my job." My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Marshall, how long have you known about our financial troubles?" "About 3 months, I admitted. It came up peripherally through work. I didn't say anything because I wanted to respect your privacy." Diane had recovered enough to go on the offensive again. "So you've been spying on our finances? Invading our privacy? That's beyond inappropriate, Marshall. It's potentially illegal." "No laws or ethical boundaries were broken," I assured her. "The information came to my attention through legitimate professional channels." "And then you used that information? How, exactly?" she pressed, a calculating look entering her eyes. The moment hung suspended between us. I could continue the pretense, denying any involvement in their financial rescue. That had been the original plan. Anonymous benefactor, no acknowledgement of my role. no opportunity for rejection of the gift. But the plan had already derailed with Diane's accusations. Perhaps transparency was the better course now. I used the information to help, I said simply. 3 sets of eyes fixed on me with varying degrees of comprehension. Melanie got there first, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It was you? You paid off their debts?" My father's expression shifted from confusion to stunned realization. "Marshall, that's not... You couldn't possibly..." "Nearly $500,000, Diane stated flatly. "You expect us to believe you had that kind of money just sitting around?" I met her skepticism directly. "I've been fortunate in my investments. The market has been good to those who positioned correctly after the downturn." "But why?" my father asked, his voice barely audible. "Why would you do that without saying anything?" "Because I knew you wouldn't accept it otherwise," I answered honestly. "Your pride wouldn't allow it. So you went behind our backs," Diane interpreted, her shock rapidly transforming into indignation. "Made financial decisions that affect our lives without our knowledge or consent." I had to admire her agility, how quickly she repositioned. From accuser to victim, from attacking me for fictional sabotage to attacking me for actual assistance. "I made a gift," I corrected gently, "one that required nothing from you except to enjoy the relief it provided." "A gift with strings attached, obviously," she retorted. "Now you expect gratitude, special treatment, perhaps even control over our decisions since you've appointed yourself our financial savior." "Diane," my father warned, but she was building momentum. "This is exactly like you, Marshall. Always needing to prove you're superior, always undermining the family structure." "Well, we didn't ask for your charity, and we certainly don't need a 20-something playing financial god with our lives." "Mom!" Melanie exclaimed. "He literally saved you from bankruptcy. How can you twist this into something negative?" Diane rose to her feet, perfectly poised despite her evident fury. "There are proper ways to offer help to family members. Secret, financial maneuvers that leave us indebted to him isn't one of them." "You're not indebted to me," I said calmly. "That was the entire point of anonymity. The gift came with no expectations of repayment or gratitude. Yet here you are, revealing yourself as the benefactor when it suits your narrative." She crossed her arms tightly. "Tell me, what prompted this sudden generosity? Guilty conscience for something else you've done?" My patience was wearing thin. "The only thing I'm guilty of is caring about my father's well-being." "Just your father's?" she pounced. "How telling that you exclude me from that statement." "Diane, enough," my father interjected, standing up. "Marshall did something extraordinarily generous for us, for our entire family. I won't have you turning it into another opportunity to drive a wedge between him and me." She turned to him, eyes widening with betrayal. "So you're taking his side? After I stood by you through the financial struggles he supposedly saved us from?" "The financial struggles you significantly contributed to," he countered, an edge entering his voice. "Do you know how many nights I've lain awake trying to figure out how to tell you we couldn't afford the lifestyle you insisted upon maintaining?" The raw honesty in his voice silenced the room. Diane stared at him as though seeing a stranger. "If that's how you feel," she said after a moment, each word precisely enunciated, "perhaps we should continue this conversation privately." "No," my father replied firmly. "No more private conversations where we pretend everything is fine in front of the children. No more secrets about our financial reality. Marshall has given us an incredible gift, not just the money, but the opportunity to start fresh with honesty." I watched astonished as my father crossed the room to stand beside me. In all our years of family tensions, he had never so explicitly chosen a position in opposition to Diane's. She recognized the significance as well. Her expression cycled rapidly through shock, hurt, and finally, cold fury. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" she hissed, her attention returning to me. You are the most ungrateful person I have ever met. And there, it was. The absurd accusation I'd been summoned to hear, now delivered with even greater irony than I could have anticipated. I might have laughed if the situation weren't so painfully revealing of how broken our family dynamic truly was. Instead, I simply held her gaze, refusing to accept the narrative she was attempting to impose. I think we all need some time to process, I said finally, rising from my chair. Dad, I'm going to head out. Our dinner tomorrow might be better. Postponed. He nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and devastated. I'll call you. As I moved toward the foyer, Diane's voice followed me, tight with controlled rage. This conversation isn't over, Marshall. There will be consequences for your interference. I paused at the doorway, turning back to face this woman who had spent 12 years subtly undermining my relationship with my father. You know what, Diane? You're right about one thing. I am ungrateful. I'm ungrateful for the constant criticism, the subtle manipulations, and the ways you've encouraged Dad to keep me at arm's length. But mostly, I'm ungrateful that it took a financial crisis for the truth about this family to finally come to light. With that, I walked out, closing the door firmly behind me on Diane's shocked expression and my father's dawning look of realization. Whatever happened next, the carefully maintained facade of our family dynamic had finally shattered, and surprisingly, it felt like the first step toward something potentially healthier. As I drove away from the house, my phone lit up with a text from Melanie. That was intense. You okay? Call me later. I would. Melanie had always been the unexpected bright spot in this blended family experiment. The stepsister who became a genuine friend despite her mother's subtle discouragement of our relationship. The night air felt clearer somehow as I navigated back toward the city, as though the truth, however messily delivered, had cleared away some long-standing toxicity. I had no illusions that one confrontation would magically repair years of dysfunctional family dynamics, but something significant had shifted. My father had stood up to Diane. He had acknowledged both her role in their financial troubles and the wedge she'd driven between us. After years of playing peacekeeper at the expense of our relationship, he'd finally chosen a different path. Whether that path would lead to lasting change remained to be seen. But for the first time since my father had married Diane, I felt something that had long been missing in our family interactions. Hope. The aftermath of Friday night's confrontation unfolded in a series of text messages and missed calls. By Saturday morning, my phone had become a digital battlefield. From Melanie. Mom and Dad fighting all night. Barely slept. She's threatening to leave if he doesn't get you under control. Whatever that means. From Dad. Need to postpone our dinner. Working through some things with Diane. Can we talk tomorrow? From an unknown number that I immediately recognized as Diane's private line. Your manipulation won't work. Thomas sees what you're doing. I left the last one unanswered, responding only to Melanie and my father with brief acknowledgments. Experience had taught me that engaging directly with Diane during one of her emotional campaigns only provided more ammunition. Instead, I channeled my frustration into a punishing workout at my building's gym, followed by several hours at my desk reviewing a potential acquisition for one of Berenson's major clients. Work had always been my refuge from family drama. Numbers followed predictable patterns, investment strategies had clear objectives, and success was measurable by concrete metrics rather than constantly shifting emotional goalposts. Around 6 that evening, my intercom buzzed. I wasn't expecting anyone and briefly considered ignoring it, but the possibility that it might be my father compelled me to answer. Mr. Anderson? There's Melanie Fisher here to see you. Says she's your sister. Stepsister, technically, though Melanie had long since earned the simpler designation through her consistent warmth and loyalty. Send her up, please. Minutes later, Melanie appeared at my door looking exhausted, her normally styled hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dressed in yoga pants and an oversized Emory University sweatshirt. Under one arm, she clutched a manila envelope. "Sorry to ambush you," she said, stepping inside. "I couldn't stand another minute in that house," I offered. Her water, which she accepted gratefully, then settled onto one of the leather bar stools at my kitchen island. Though she'd visited before, her eyes still wandered appreciatively around the open-concept space with its wall of windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. "Still can't believe you own this place," she commented, shaking her head. "Mom always made it sound like you were barely making rent on some starter apartment." "Diane has a unique ability to reshape reality to fit her preferred narrative," I replied dryly. "Speaking of which, how bad is it at the house?" Melanie took a long drink of water. "Apocalyptic. I've never seen them fight like this. Dad actually slept in the guest room last night. That was unprecedented. In all their years of marriage, my father had maintained the appearance of marital harmony at all costs, even when it meant sacrificing his relationship with me." "What exactly are they fighting about?" I asked, though I could guess. "Everything. The money issues they've apparently been hiding from me. Your involvement. But mostly I think about you." She fixed me with a direct look. "Dad keeps saying he's failed you, that he's allowed Diane to dictate the terms of your relationship for too long. She's telling him you're manipulating him, trying to drive a wedge between them." I leaned against the counter, absorbing this. "And what do you think?" "I think," she said carefully, "that 12 years of Diane's subtle campaign against you has finally reached its breaking point. And I think you paying off their debts, which, by the way, is absolutely incredible, and I still can't believe you did that, forced them to confront issues they've been dancing around forever." She slid the manila envelope across the counter toward me. "Which brings me to why I'm here. I found these while looking for my birth certificate in Dad's study this morning. I think you should see them." Curious, I opened the envelope and extracted several folded documents. The first was a legal letter dated nearly 11 years ago from a custody attorney. As I scanned it, my breath caught. "This is Dad's initial plan to seek joint physical custody of you after the divorce," Melanie confirmed. "From what I can piece together from the other correspondence, he abandoned the petition after marrying Mom." I unfolded the second document, a draft parenting plan that would have had me living with my father every other week, holidays divided equally with my mother. A far cry from the actual arrangement that followed the divorce, where I saw my father only one weekend a month, with occasional holiday visits that became increasingly rare as the years progressed. "There's more," Melanie said quietly. The third document knocked the wind from me entirely. A letter from my college-age self to my father, written during my sophomore year at Penn. I had forgotten to write it, an earnest, vulnerable plea for more connection, expressing how much I missed our relationship, and asking to spend the upcoming summer break with him rather than taking an internship. Paperclipped to it was Diane's handwritten note to my father. "Discussed with Marshall by phone. He's decided the internship makes more sense for his career goals. No need to call him back about this. He's embarrassed about getting emotional. Let him focus on school." A conversation that had never happened. A response I had never given. A summer where I had waited for a call that never came. Eventually, assuming my father had been too busy or uninterested in spending time with his son. "Where did you find these?" I asked, my voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Hidden in a false bottom of the antique desk drawer. I was looking for my own documents and accidentally discovered the hidden compartment." Melanie's expression was sympathetic but not pitying. "I couldn't not show you." I refolded the papers carefully, mind racing. "Does Dad know you found these?" She shook her head. "He and Mom were having round 15 of their argument in the kitchen. I slipped out without either of them noticing." I tried to process the implications of these documents. For years, I had assumed my diminished relationship with my father was primarily his choice. that he had prioritized his new marriage, new family, new life over maintaining a close bond with his son. These papers suggested a more complex and troubling reality. She intercepted my letters, I said, the realization crystallizing. Probably phone calls, too. All those times I thought he was just too busy. Marshall, you have to confront him with these, Melanie urged. For both your sakes. I stared out the window at the darkening city skyline, emotions warring within me. Anger at Diane's manipulation, pain at the years of connection lost, but also, surprisingly, a flicker of hope. If my father had initially wanted more involvement in my life, if he hadn't actually rejected my attempts to stay connected, I'm not sure confrontation is the answer, I said finally. These documents are 11 years old. Showing them to him now, when things are already volatile between him and Diane, would be completely justified, Melanie insisted. She actively sabotaged your relationship with your father for years. That's not something you just sweep under the rug for the sake of family harmony, isn't it? I gave her a wry smile. Isn't that exactly what we've all been doing for the past decade? Ignoring Diane's manipulations to keep the peace? Melanie crossed her arms stubbornly. Well, maybe the peace isn't worth keeping anymore. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. My father's number. I showed Melanie the screen. Speak of the devil, she murmured. Are you going to answer? I hesitated, then accepted the call, putting it on speaker so Melanie could hear. Dad? Marshall. His voice sounded strained. I need to see you. Tonight, if possible. I glanced at Melanie, who nodded encouragingly. Everything okay? No. The blunt admission was startling from my typically reserved father. Nothing's okay, but I'm trying to fix that. Can I come to your place? I don't want to have this conversation over the phone. After confirming my address, which he had never visited despite my living there for over a year, we disconnected. Melanie raised her eyebrows. Well, that's unexpected. Want me to make myself scarce? I considered this. Actually, no. You're part of this family, too. Unless you're uncomfortable being here, she shook her head. I've spent years watching Mom subtly undermine your place in the family. I'm not missing the reckoning. While we waited for my father to arrive, Melanie and I ordered takeout from the Thai place down the street, neither of us having much appetite but recognizing the need for sustenance before another emotionally charged conversation. As we picked at pad thai and green curry, Melanie filled me in on other developments. Mom's been on the phone all day with her friends, spinning some narrative about family betrayal and ingratitude. From what I overheard, she's positioning herself as the victim of ungrateful stepchildren and a husband who doesn't appreciate her sacrifices. Classic Diane, I noted, unsurprised. Rewriting reality in real time to maintain her self-image. The worst part is, some of her friends are totally buying it. I got 3 passive-aggressive texts from Mrs. Landry asking how I could turn against the woman who raised me as her own. I snorted. The woman who raised you as her own? Diane barely attended your high school graduation because it conflicted with her spa weekend. Right? Melanie shook her head in disbelief. The revisionist, history is breathtaking. The buzzer interrupted our commiseration. My doorman announced my father's arrival, and minutes later, a knock at the door revealed Thomas Anderson looking utterly unlike his usual polished self. He had clearly dressed in haste. His button-down shirt was slightly rumpled, his usually perfect hair uncombed, and the shadowed stubble on his jaw suggested he hadn't shaved that morning. But the most striking difference was in his posture, the confident bearing of the successful consultant, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a man carrying an invisible weight. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Melanie. You're here. Too. She crossed her arms defensively. Problem? No. Actually, it's good. You should hear this too. He stepped inside, taking in the penthouse with an appraising glance. This is not what I expected. Diane always described your place as a modest starter apartment. I finished for him. I know. She has her own interpretation of reality. My father winced at this, accepting the water I offered and settling onto the sofa. For a moment, none of us spoke, the weight of unaddressed history hanging in the air between us. I'm leaving. Diane, he finally said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Melanie gasped softly beside me. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. I should clarify, he added, staring down at his hands. I've asked her for a separation. Whether that leads to divorce will depend on many factors, including her willingness to acknowledge certain patterns in our relationship. What prompted this? I asked carefully. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. Your generosity forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about our financial situation, about my marriage, and most importantly, about how I've failed you as a father. Melanie shifted uncomfortably beside me. Dad, I should probably go. This seems like a conversation you and Marshall need to have privately. Stay, please, my father said, surprising us both. What I have to say concerns you too, though differently. And frankly, I could use moral support. She settled back, exchanging a glance with me. This vulnerability from my typically reserved father was unprecedented. For years, he continued, I've been making excuses for Diane's behavior toward you, Marshall, telling myself she just needed time to adjust to being a stepmother, that the tension between you was natural and would resolve itself eventually. I convinced myself that maintaining peace in my marriage was the priority, even when that peace came at the expense of my relationship with my son. My throat tightened. Despite the revelations Melanie had brought me, hearing my father acknowledge, this reality aloud was unexpectedly affecting. After you left last night, Diane and I had the most honest conversation of our entire marriage. Or perhaps I should say I finally started being honest. About the resentment I've harbored over how she's treated you, about the financial stress her spending has caused, about the way I've compromised my own values to avoid conflict. He took a shaky breath. She didn't take it well. When I refused to back down, she gave me an ultimatum. Either I cut you out of my life entirely, or our marriage was over. Melanie made a small sound of distress. She can't be serious. She's never been more serious about anything, my father replied grimly, which made my decision remarkably simple in the end. No marriage is worth abandoning my child. The simplicity of this statement, the parental priority that should have been obvious all along, hit me with unexpected force. My carefully maintained emotional control wavered. It's a little late for that realization, I said more sharply than I intended. My father nodded, accepting the rebuke. You're right. It's years too late. I can't recover the time we've lost, Marshall. I can only try to do better going forward, if you're willing to give me that chance. Melanie nudged me gently, nodding toward the manila envelope on the coffee table. Understanding her silent message, I reached for it. Before I respond to that, there's something you should see. I handed him the envelope. Melanie found these on your desk this morning. He looked confused as he opened it, but as he unfolded the custody petition, recognition dawned in his eyes. By the time he reached my college letter and Diane's attached note, his face had drained of color. He whispered, staring at the documents. Marshall, I never saw this letter, and I never spoke with Diane about your request to spend the summer with me. I know, I said quietly. Just like I now realize you probably never received most of my calls during my college years, or chose not to respond to my attempts to connect. He looked up, anguish written across his features. There were calls, letters, dozens at first. I eventually stopped trying. My father set the papers down with trembling hands, looking physically ill. I thought you were busy with your new life. Your mother told me you had decided our weekend visits were too disruptive to your academic schedule, that you preferred to focus on school and internships. I tried to respect what I thought were your wishes. Another manipulation, this time from my mother's side. The web of parental deceit was apparently woven from both directions. But my mother's motivations, likely a combination of bitter divorce residue and genuine belief that she was protecting me from further disappointment, felt distinctly different from Diane's calculated campaign to isolate my father from his first family. I missed you, I said simply, the admission costing me more than the $500,000 I'd spent erasing their debt. I thought you didn't miss me back. Every day, he replied, his voice breaking. I missed you every single day. Melanie discreetly wiped tears from her cheeks, remaining silent but offering her presence as witness to this long-overdue honesty between father and son. I don't expect your forgiveness, my father continued, or an immediate restoration of our relationship. I'm just asking for the opportunity to try to rebuild what we lost, what I allowed to be taken from us. I studied him, this man who had been both a hero and disappointment throughout my life. The father who had taught me to fish and throw a spiral, who had cheered at my little league games and helped with science projects. The same father who had slowly disappeared from my life after remarrying, who had allowed his new wife to dictate the terms of our relationship, who had chosen peace at home over connection with his son. The easy response would be anger, recrimination, a demand for apologies that could never adequately address years of emotional neglect. But looking at him now, genuinely remorseful, finally choosing me over Diane's manipulation, I found myself unwilling to perpetuate the cycle of emotional distance. I can't promise the relationship you're hoping for, I said carefully. Too much has happened, but I'm willing to try moving forward if you are. Relief flooded his features. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, I cautioned. This isn't going to be easy. Diane isn't going to simply accept being sidelined. And these revelations about her deliberately interfering with our relationship, there needs to be accountability there. There. Will be, he assured me. The separation is just the beginning. I've already contacted our family attorney to discuss next steps. She'll be meeting with us on Monday to begin formal proceedings. Melanie, who had been quietly observing our exchange, finally spoke up. Where will you stay, Dad? You can't go back to the house tonight. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. I've booked a hotel for the immediate future. The Residence Inn near my office. It's not ideal, but it's temporary. That's ridiculous, I said immediately. I have a guest room that's never been used. Stay here until you figure out your next steps. My father looked surprised, then deeply moved by the offer. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's what family does. The words came easily, despite years of evidence to the contrary. Perhaps this was the beginning of redefining what family meant for us. As we arranged for my father to collect some essentials from the house, strategically timed for when Diane would be at her Sunday brunch gathering, my phone lit up with yet another text from the unknown number. You've turned them both against me. I hope you're satisfied with destroying this family. This isn't over. I showed the message to my father, who read it with a pained expression. I'm sorry, he said, handing back the phone. For what it's worth, you haven't destroyed anything. You've simply forced us to confront what was already broken. Later that night, after Melanie had returned home, promising to keep us updated on Diane's movements, and my father had settled into the guest room, I stood at my living room windows, watching the city lights below. The events of the past 72 hours felt surreal, from anonymous benefactor to family scapegoat to tentative reconciliation with my father. What had begun as a simple financial transaction, clearing debts to ease my father's burden, had catalyzed. The collapse of a family facade that had been maintained for over a decade. The immediate future promised more conflict, especially once Diane realized my father's separation threat was genuine. Her text message made it clear she had no intention of relinquishing control without a fight. Yet despite the uncertainty ahead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in my family relationships for years: authenticity. The painful truth was finally exposed, creating space for genuine connection where pretense had previously ruled. My phone buzzed with one final message for the night. Not from Diane this time, but from Melanie. Whatever happens next, thank you for giving Dad the courage to choose truth over false peace. Some families need to break before they can truly heal. Perhaps she was right. The facade of family harmony had finally shattered, but from those fractured foundations, something more genuine might yet emerge. Monday morning arrived with the soft chime of my phone alarm. For a moment, the events of the weekend felt like an elaborate dream, until I heard movement in the guest bathroom. My father, preparing for his day in my home. Reality rushed back in full force. I pulled on workout clothes and headed to the kitchen, starting coffee for two instead of my usual single cup. By the time my father emerged, dressed in a crisp shirt and slacks he'd retrieved from the house, yesterday while Diane was out, I had breakfast waiting. "You didn't need to do this," he said, eyeing the omelet and toast with evident appreciation. "It's no trouble." I slid a mug of coffee toward him. "Black? 2 sugars, right?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "You remember?" Some habits stay with you. Like preparing his coffee exactly as he preferred during our weekend visits years ago, eager to impress him with my growing independence. We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "I meet with Patricia at 10, the family attorney. Would you be willing to join us? There are financial matters to discuss that might benefit from your expertise." The request, his acknowledgement of my professional capabilities, was a small thing, but significant given our history. "I can move some things around. Just text me the address." He nodded gratefully. "And Melanie? Should she be there?" "Let's keep it just for the initial consultation," I suggested. Melanie's caught enough crossfire already. After he left for his office, looking more determined than I'd seen him in years, I called Kim to reschedule my morning meetings. As senior portfolio manager, I had considerable flexibility in my schedule, but I rarely used it for personal matters. Today was an exception. Patricia Chen's law office occupied a sleek suite in a midtown high-rise, all gleaming surfaces and abstract art. The attorney herself matched her surroundings, polished, precise, and radiating quiet competence. "Thomas has briefed me on the situation," she said after introductions, "but I'd like to hear your perspective as well, Marshall, particularly regarding the financial aspects." I summarized the events that had led us here: my discovery of their debt, the anonymous payment, Diane's bizarre accusation, and the subsequent revelations about her interference in our relationship. Patricia took meticulous notes, her expression professionally neutral. "And the debt payment, approximately $500,000, came entirely from your personal funds?" "Yes." "Transferred through a series of accounts to maintain anonymity, which was only recently compromised when you revealed yourself as the source," she clarified. "Correct. During the confrontation with Diane." She set down her pen, considering. "That creates an interesting legal situation. While the money was clearly a gift with no expectation of repayment, Diane might attempt to characterize it differently during separation proceedings." My father frowned. "What do you mean?" "She could argue it represents a loan to the marriage that must be factored into asset division. Or more problematically, she could claim it was a manipulative attempt to gain leverage over the family finances." "That's absurd," my father protested. "But exactly the kind of narrative Diane excels at constructing," I pointed out. Patricia nodded. "Precisely why we need documentation clarifying your intent. I'll prepare a gift affidavit for you to sign, Marshall, stating explicitly that the funds were provided with no expectation of repayment or control. Whatever you need, She turned to my father. Now, regarding the separation itself, Georgia is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state. This means assets acquired during the marriage will be divided fairly, but not necessarily equally. My father ran a hand through his hair. Most of our assets are tied up in the house and my business, both of which have been significantly compromised by debt, then rescued by Marshall's intervention, Patricia noted. This complicates matters. The house, in particular, may become a point of contention. Diane won't want to leave it, my father said. Her social standing is tied to that address. Unfortunately, maintaining the property may not be financially feasible for either of you separately. The mortgage, even without the second lien Marshall paid off, remains substantial. I had been running calculations in my head as they spoke. What if I purchased the house? Both turned to me, surprised. As an investment property, I clarified, at market value. The proceeds could be divided as part of the separation agreement, providing both with liquid assets for fresh starts. Patricia tapped her pen thoughtfully. An interesting proposition. It removes the emotional component from that particular asset, though Diane might still object to losing the house. She'd object less to losing it to a neutral third party than to having Thomas retain it, I pointed out. And this way, she'd at least receive fair compensation. My father was studying me with a mixture of surprise and admiration. You'd do that? Purchase a house you don't even want? It's a sound investment in the current market, I replied, downplaying the personal aspect, and it simplifies an otherwise complex situation. The truth was more complicated. By purchasing the house, I could ensure my father wasn't financially ruined by the separation. It would also remove Diane's primary leverage point, her emotional attachment to the property she'd spent years curating into a showcase home. Patricia made a note. I'll include this as a potential resolution in our initial proposal. Now, regarding Thomas's business assets, the consultation continued for another hour, covering everything from retirement accounts to personal property. Throughout, I found myself impressed by my father's clarity and resolve. This was not the conflict-avoidant man who had allowed Diane to dictate terms for over a decade. This was someone finally standing up for himself, and for me. As we left Patricia's office, he turned to me with a somber expression. I've been thinking about something else, something I should have done years ago. What's that? Updated my will and medical directives. With everything that's happened, I want to ensure my wishes are clear. Would you be willing to be my healthcare proxy and executor? The request caught me off guard. These were roles typically assigned to spouses, not estranged children. Are you sure? Diane will see it as another betrayal. I'm done making decisions based on Diane's reactions, he said firmly. You're my son. It should have been you all along. Something shifted between us with those words, a restoration of a connection that had been systematically dismantled over years. I nodded, unable to fully articulate the significance of this small but profound realignment of our family structure. I'll do it. As we parted ways, him to his office, me to finally start my workday, my phone buzzed with a message from Melanie. Mom's on the warpath. Called a family meeting for tonight. Says she has evidence about something. What should I do? I frowned at the screen. Evidence? About what? Before I could respond, another text arrived. This one from Diane's number. Your financial manipulations have been reported to the appropriate authorities. Hope your career was worth sacrificing for this little power play. Ice settled in my stomach. The appropriate authorities could only mean one thing. She was threatening to report the anonymous debt payment as some kind of financial impropriety. A baseless accusation, but one that could cause professional complications if she convinced someone to investigate. I forwarded both messages to my father, then called Melanie. What exactly did she say about this evidence? I asked as soon as she answered. just that she has proof of financial misconduct that will change everything. She's been making calls all morning to her country club friends whose husbands work in banking or law. I think she's fishing for advice on how to cause maximum damage. Has she mentioned my firm specifically, Berenson Capital? Not that I've heard, but I haven't been home much. I'm avoiding the war zone. Melanie's voice dropped. Marshall, she's really unhinged about this. I've never seen her like this. Stay clear of her for now, I advised. And don't attend that family meeting. It's just a staged opportunity for her to make accusations. After hanging up, I made 2 calls of my own. The first was to Berenson's legal department, giving them a heads up about potential spurious complaints from my estranged stepmother. The second was to my personal attorney, Andrew Kellman, who had helped structure the anonymous debt payment in the first place. She has no case, Andrew assured me after I explained the situation. The transactions were perfectly legal. You're allowed to give gifts, even anonymous ones, to family members. She's suggesting I misappropriated funds or engaged in money laundering. Based on what evidence? The money came from your personal accounts, not client funds. Everything was documented and above board. Evidence doesn't matter if she can create enough smoke to trigger an investigation, I pointed out. In my industry, even the appearance of impropriety can be damaging. Andrew was silent for a moment. Let me make some calls. If she's been shopping this story around to financial institutions or regulatory bodies, I can find out. In the meantime, don't engage directly with her. Any communication should go through your father's attorney. By late afternoon, my father had moved the rest of his essential belongings to my guest room. The promised family meeting proceeded without either of us, though Melanie texted updates in real time. She's telling everyone you embezzled money from your firm to pay off Dad's debts. Now she's saying you did it to sabotage their marriage, because you've always been jealous of her relationship with Dad. Uncle Rick asked for evidence and she got flustered. Started talking about sources in the financial industry who confirmed irregularities. The last update was the most concerning. She's drafted some kind of formal complaint letter. I couldn't see who it's addressed to. Andrew called as I was reading this final text. Good news and bad news. The good news is she hasn't filed any formal complaints with regulatory bodies yet. The bad news is she's been calling everyone from the SEC to the Georgia Banking Commission trying to find someone who'll take her seriously. Has she gained any traction? Not yet. But she did speak with someone at Berenson yesterday, Bradford Mills in compliance. Apparently, they went to college together. Bradford Mills. Of course. The one person in our compliance department known for his overzealous approach to even minor irregularities. If Diane had gotten to him, what did she tell him? She suggested you might have inappropriately used client information to identify your father's creditors. It's thin, but Mills apparently agreed to look into it. I closed my eyes briefly. This was exactly the complication I'd feared, not because there was any actual impropriety to discover, but because the investigation itself could become a professional distraction. I need to get ahead of this, I decided. I'll speak with James Berenson directly tomorrow. Full transparency about the situation. Smart move, Andrew agreed. Better to control the narrative. After we hung up, I found my father in the kitchen, staring blankly at his phone. Diane? I guessed. He nodded, showing me the screen. A barrage of texts ranging from pleading, "Please come home, we can work this out," to threatening, "You'll lose everything if you continue this foolishness." Patricia advised me not to respond directly, he said, looking exhausted. All communication should go through her now. Good advice. I hesitated, then decided full disclosure was important. You should know Diane's escalating things. She's trying to cause problems for me at Berenson. His expression darkened. What kind of problems? I summarized what Andrew had told me, watching my father's face transform from concern to anger. This is unacceptable, he said finally. Using your professional reputation as leverage against me. It's a predictable move, I said, trying to sound more casual than I felt. She's identified what we both value and is targeting it systematically. I'll call Patricia immediately. We need to send a cease and desist letter. No, I interrupted. Let me handle the professional side. You focus on the separation proceedings. Competing legal actions will just complicate things. He looked ready to argue, then deflated slightly. You're right. I'm sorry she's dragging you into this. I'm already in it, I reminded him wryly. $500,000 in. The unexpected joke, dark as it was, startled a laugh from him. When you commit to something, you don't do it halfway. An Anderson family trait, I replied, the shared moment of levity offering a brief respite from the tension surrounding us. The next morning, I requested a meeting with James Berenson, the firm's founder and CEO. Though I reported to the chief investment officer in the formal hierarchy, James maintained an open-door policy for senior staff facing significant challenges. His corner office offered panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, the desk positioned to take advantage of the natural light. At 68, James retained the sharp intelligence and direct manner that had built Berenson Capital from a boutique advisory firm into one of the Southeast's premier wealth management companies. Marshall. He gestured me to a seat, studying me with shrewd eyes. Bradford Mills visited me yesterday with some interesting concerns. I nodded, having anticipated this. That's why I'm here. I wanted to provide full context. Please do. His tone was neutral, neither accusing nor supportive. I laid out the situation concisely. My discovery of my father's financial troubles, my decision to anonymously clear their debts, and the subsequent family fallout when my stepmother discovered my role. She's now attempting to reframe my actions as financial misconduct, I concluded. There was none. The funds came entirely from my personal accounts. The transactions were structured for anonymity, not concealment of impropriety. James was silent for a moment, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. The anonymity structure, that was Andrew Kellman's work? Yes. Good, he's meticulous. Another pause. Did you use any information obtained through Berenson's systems or client relationships to facilitate these transactions? No. My awareness of my father's financial situation came through standard background checks when he was erroneously flagged as a potential client. Once I identified the conflict of interest, I recused myself formally from any professional involvement. James nodded, seemingly satisfied. What does your stepmother hope to achieve with these accusations? Leverage in my father's separation proceedings. She's attempting to intimidate both him and me into backing down. A slight smile crossed James's face. She doesn't know you very well, does she? The observation, accurate and unexpectedly personal, caught me off guard. We've maintained a polite distance over the years. Clearly. He leaned back in his chair. Here's how we'll handle this. I'll speak with Bradford directly and clarify that any investigation needs to follow standard protocols, not special channels established through personal connections. Your records will be reviewed. That's unavoidable given the complaint. But the review will be fair and contextual. I appreciate that. In the meantime, continue your client work as normal. If your stepmother contacts anyone else at the firm, they'll be instructed to refer her to legal. He fixed me with a direct look. Family difficulties happen, Marshall. How we handle them reveals character. So far, I see no cause for concern about yours. The vote of confidence lifted a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged. Thank you, James. As I left his office, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Not Diane this time, but a name I recognized with immediate unease. Bradford Mills. Need. To discuss irregularities in accounts related to T. Anderson transactions. My office, 2 p.m. today. So it begins, I thought grimly. The professional cost of my personal intervention was becoming clear. While James's support provided some protection, I would still face scrutiny and the associated stress. Had it been worth it? The question lingered as I returned to my office, closing the door for a moment of privacy. $500,000, professional complications, family turmoil, all because I couldn't bear to see my father drowning in debt he'd accumulated largely to maintain Diane's lifestyle. My contemplation was interrupted by another text, this one, from my father. Patricia has filed the formal separation papers. Diane has been served. Brace for impact. I stared at the message, imagining Diane's reaction to receiving legal documents making the separation official. Her carefully constructed world, maintained through manipulation and my father's conflict avoidance, was crumbling around her. She would not accept this quietly. As if summoned by my thoughts, my desk phone rang. The building security desk. Mr. Anderson? There's a Diane Fisher here insisting on seeing you. She doesn't have an appointment and she's becoming disruptive. Diane. Here, at Berenson Capital. I'll be right down, I said, rising immediately. The security guard's description of disruptive proved to be an understatement. When I reached the lobby, Diane was engaged in a heated exchange with the receptionist, her voice carrying across the marble expanse. Absolutely need to see him immediately. This is a family emergency. Mrs. Fisher? I called, approaching. Cautiously. She whirled toward me, eyes bright with a fervor I'd never seen before. Gone was the carefully coiffed, controlled woman who had presided over family dinners with icy precision. This Diane was disheveled, her designer outfit wrinkled, her normally perfect makeup slightly smudged. You! She hissed, advancing toward me. You think you're so clever, don't you? Using your financial tricks to steal my husband, poison my daughter against me? The security guard moved closer, clearly concerned by her tone. I gestured for him to wait. This isn't the place for this conversation, I said quietly. Let's go somewhere private. Oh, you'd like that, wouldn't you? More secrets, more manipulation, behind closed doors? Her voice rose, drawing the attention of everyone in the lobby. Well, I'm done with secrets. Everyone should know what you've done. Several colleagues had paused near the elevators, watching with undisguised curiosity. This was exactly the scene I'd hoped to avoid, my personal drama spilling into my professional space, undermining the careful separation I'd always maintained between the two realms. Diane, I said, keeping my voice low and calm. I understand. You're upset about the separation. But this, coming to my workplace, creating a scene, will only make things worse. Worse? She laughed, a brittle sound that held no humor. You've destroyed my family, my security, my reputation. How could it possibly get worse? By continuing this public display, I answered honestly. This won't help your position in the separation proceedings. It won't bring Thomas back. It will only reinforce his decision to leave. My bluntness seemed to penetrate her emotional state. She stilled, seeming to finally register our surroundings. The watching eyes, the security guard poised to intervene, the receptionist with her finger, hovering near what was almost certainly a panic button. You've turned them all against me, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Thomas, Melanie, everyone. With your money and your calm, reasonable manner. The perfect son who swooped in to save the day. There was such genuine pain beneath. Her anger that, despite everything, I felt a momentary flicker of compassion. Diane had built her entire identity around being the sophisticated wife of a successful consultant, the perfect stepmother, the social director of our family. Now that construct was collapsing, leaving her grasping for someone to blame. No one has been turned against you, I said gently. But relationships have consequences. Actions have consequences. Like paying our debts without permission? Like interfering in a marriage that was none of your business? Her voice started to rise again. Like intercepting letters between a father and son, I countered quietly. Like giving ultimatums that force a man to choose between his wife and his child. The color drained from her face. He told you about that. He told me everything, Diane, just as I've told him everything. We're done with secrets and manipulations. She stared at me, something shifting in her expression, the realization, perhaps, that her usual tactics would no longer work. That the careful ecosystem of half-truths and emotional leverage she had cultivated for years had finally collapsed. "This isn't over," she said finally, but the threat sounded hollow even to my ears. "I still have options. I'm sure you do, but coming. To my workplace isn't one of them." I gestured toward the exit. "I'll walk you to your car." For a moment I thought she might refuse, might escalate the confrontation further. Instead, she gathered what remained of her dignity and turned toward the door, her shoulders straight despite the obvious defeat. As we walked silently to the parking garage, I wondered what options she still believed she had, and what further complications awaited as this family implosion continued to unfold. 2 days after Diane's scene at Berenson Capital, I found myself in Bradford Mills's meticulously organized office, watching him flip through transaction records with the fastidious attention of someone searching for a single grain of sand on a pristine beach. "These transfers," he said, tapping a highlighted section, "occurred within a 48-hour period, all to different entities, but ultimately flowing to your father's creditors." "Yes," I confirmed. "As I've explained, I structured the transactions for anonymity, not concealment." Bradford adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the lenses. Anonymity from whom exactly? My father and stepmother. I wanted to help without creating a sense of obligation or indebtedness. "So you acknowledge deliberately concealing your identity as the source of these funds." I maintained my composure, despite the obvious attempt to reframe my actions in a suspicious light. "I acknowledge giving an anonymous gift to family members in financial distress. There's no regulatory prohibition against that." Bradford's mouth tightened into a thin line. "There are prohibitions against using confidential information obtained through professional channels for personal benefit." I didn't benefit personally from these transactions. In fact, quite the opposite. "Your father benefited," he countered, "and by extension, your family unit." "My father was not and is not a client of Berenson Capital," I stated for what felt like the 10th time. The initial flag in our system was erroneous, which I documented immediately upon discovery. Bradford closed the folder with a precise movement. "I'll need to review this further with legal. In the meantime, I'd like you to provide a detailed, written account of how you first became aware of these financial issues." "I've already provided that statement to James Berenson and legal counsel," I reminded him. "You should have received a copy this morning." His expression suggested this procedural end run hadn't been appreciated. "Yes, well, I may have additional questions after reviewing it." As I left his office, I couldn't shake the sense that Bradford's investigation had less to do with regulatory concerns and more to do with his personal connection to Diane. Their college association had clearly created a bias that no amount of documentation might fully overcome. My suspicion was confirmed when I returned to my office to find an email from Diane to Bradford, accidentally or perhaps deliberately copied to me, thanking him for taking these serious concerns about Marshall's financial activities seriously, and mentioning their lovely catch-up lunch scheduled for Friday. I forwarded the email to Andrew Kellman with a brief note. "Potential conflict of interest in internal investigation." My phone rang almost immediately. "This is exactly what we need," Andrew said without preamble. "Mills has compromised the objectivity of his investigation by maintaining social contact with the complainant, your stepmother, during an active review. Will that be enough to have him removed from the case? Better. It's grounds to request an independent review from outside the firm, which is what we wanted anyway." Mills has too much invested now in finding something to justify his friend Diane's accusations. Relief washed through me. What's the next step? I'll draft a formal request for James Berenson, citing this email as evidence of procedural compromise. In the meantime, continue cooperating fully, but document every interaction with Mills. After hanging up, I checked my watch. Almost 5. My scheduled meeting with the property assessor at my father's house, soon potentially to be my investment property, was in 45 minutes. As I gathered my things, my desk phone rang, the security desk again. Mr. Anderson? Sorry to bother you, but there's a young woman here asking for you. Says she's your sister, Melanie Fisher? Melanie? Unexpected, but not unwelcome. I'll be right down. Unlike Diane's dramatic appearance, Melanie's presence in the lobby was subdued. She sat quietly on one of the leather sofas, dressed casually in jeans and a Georgia Tech sweatshirt, scrolling through her phone. When she saw me, her expression was a mixture of relief and anxiety. Sorry to ambush you. At work, she said as I approached. I didn't know where else to go. What's happened? She glanced around the busy lobby. Can we talk somewhere private? I led her to a small conference room off the main floor, closing the door behind us. As soon as we were alone, Melanie's composed facade crumbled. Mom's lost it, Marshall. Completely. Lost it. She went through my phone while I was in the shower this morning, saw my text with you and Dad, and just... She made an explosive gesture with her hands. Full nuclear meltdown. Accused me of betraying her, conspiring against her, even suggesting I might have known about the financial problems all along and kept them from her. I leaned against the conference table, processing this development. Are you okay? Did she threaten you? Not physically, if that's what you mean, but she said I had until the end of the week to choose a side. Her exact words were, either you're with me or against me, and if you're against me, you can find somewhere else to live. She's trying to evict you from your own home? I asked incredulously. She says it's her home since she's the one who made it a real home with all her decorating and hosting and whatever. Melanie ran a hand through her hair, frustrated. I know it's stupid. I'm 25. I should have my own place anyway. But I've been saving for a down payment, and Atlanta rents are insane, and... Mel, I interrupted gently. You don't need to justify still living at home, and you certainly don't deserve to be kicked out because you refuse to take sides in their separation. She looked down at her hands. I have taken a side, though. That's the thing. I think Dad's right to leave. I think Mom has been not great. To you, to him, sometimes to me when I don't live up to her expectations. She looked up, her expression vulnerable. Does that make me a terrible daughter? No, I said firmly. It makes you honest. Diane excels at creating loyalty tests that no one can pass. Don't let her manipulate you into feeling guilty for seeing the situation clearly. Melanie nodded, wiping away a stray tear. So what do I do now? I don't have anywhere to go if she follows through on her threat. I checked my watch again. The property assessor would be waiting, but this was more important. You come stay with us, obviously. Dad's in the guest room, but the office has a pull-out sofa that's surprisingly comfortable. I couldn't impose like that. It's not an imposition, I said, echoing what I'd told my father days earlier. It's what family does. The simplicity of the statement, and the certainty behind it, seemed to settle something for her. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you. I don't think it will come to that. Mom's probably just trying to scare me into compliance, but knowing I have options helps. Always, I assured her. And speaking of options, I need to meet a property assessor at the house in 30 minutes. Want to come with me? I can fill you in on the latest developments on the way. During the drive, I explained the plan to purchase the house at market value, the financial arrangements being worked out through our respective attorneys, and Diane's attempts to create professional problems for me. That's why she was so smug at breakfast. Melanie realized. She mentioned something about certain people finally facing consequences, but I assumed she was talking about Dad. She's targeting both of us, I confirmed, though her allegations against me have no substance. As we pulled into the familiar driveway, I spotted the assessor's car already parked along the curb. What I hadn't expected was Diane's Mercedes still in the garage. She was supposed to be at a charity committee meeting according to Melanie's earlier intelligence. Should we reschedule? Melanie asked, noticing my hesitation. I considered the options. Rescheduling would delay the already tight timeline for the house purchase. Proceeding meant potentially another confrontation with Diane. No, I decided. We have every right to be here with the assessor. Your father arranged this appointment through proper channels. The assessor, a trim, efficient woman named Ellen Santiago, was waiting on the front steps with a clipboard and digital camera. I introduced myself and Melanie, explaining our respective connections to the property. Mr. Thomas Anderson arranged for me to complete a full interior and exterior assessment, Ellen confirmed, consulting her notes. I have his written authorization. Here. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the front door swung open to reveal Diane. Unlike her disheveled appearance at my office, she was now immaculately dressed in a tailored St. John suit, hair and makeup flawless. The perfect image of the sophisticated homeowner, presumably for the assessor's benefit. Marshall. Melanie. Her tone was arctic. What a surprise. Hello, Diane, I replied evenly. We're here for the property assessment Father arranged. Her smile never reached her eyes. Yes, Ellen and I were just discussing that. I've explained that there's been a misunderstanding. The house isn't actually on the market, Ellen glanced between us uncertainly. I have authorization from the owner, Thomas Anderson, co-owner, Diane corrected smoothly. And as co-owner, I'm informing you that this assessment is premature. The property's status is subject to ongoing legal discussions. I maintained my professional demeanor, aware that the assessor was now witness to what was essentially a family dispute. The assessment is a preliminary step that doesn't commit the property to sale. It's standard procedure in separation arrangements. Diane's expression hardened momentarily before she recovered her poised facade. Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately, Marshall. Ellen, would you mind giving us a moment? The assessor looked profoundly uncomfortable. I'm on a tight schedule today. If there's a dispute about my authorization to proceed, there's no dispute, I interjected firmly. Mr. Anderson's attorney confirmed this appointment with your office yesterday. The co-owner's reluctance doesn't invalidate his legal right to obtain an assessment. Ellen hesitated, then nodded. That's correct from a procedural standpoint. However, I do need access to the interior, which requires cooperation. Diane crossed her arms, a calculated gesture of resistance. And if I refuse that access, then you'd be interfering with a legally authorized proceeding, I said calmly, something I'm sure your attorney would advise against, as it could be viewed unfavorably in the separation negotiations. Melanie, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly stepped forward. Mom, please don't do this. You're only making things harder for everyone. Diane's attention snapped to her daughter, eyes narrowing. So you're involved in this scheme too? After our conversation this morning, I had hoped you'd reconsider your position. It's not about taking positions, Melanie said, a new firmness in her voice that I hadn't heard before. It's about doing what's fair. Dad has the right to get the house assessed. And I have the right to my home, Diane countered, emotion briefly cracking through her composed exterior. No one's taking your home today, I pointed out reasonably. This is just an assessment to determine its current market value. Any decisions about the property's future will be handled through proper legal channels. Ellen checked her watch pointedly. I really do need to begin if I'm going to complete the assessment today. For a moment, I thought Diane might physically block the doorway. Instead, she stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. By all means, though I must insist on accompanying you through my home to ensure nothing is misrepresented. That's standard procedure anyway, Ellen assured her professional demeanor firmly back in place. Homeowners typically guide the assessment. As Ellen and Diane disappeared into the house, Melanie exhaled loudly beside me. Well, that was tense. Could have been worse, I observed. At least no one called security this time. She gave me a questioning look. Long story, I'll fill you in later. I gestured toward the house. Shall we? I'd like to document the property's condition myself, for reference. For the next hour, we followed at a discreet distance as Ellen methodically assessed each room, taking measurements and photographs while Diane provided a running commentary on the premium finishes, custom features, and recent upgrades. I took my own notes, focusing on structural elements and maintenance issues that might affect valuation. The controlled tension was palpable, especially when we reached the master suite, the domain Diane had claimed almost exclusively during the marriage, relegating my father to the smaller attached dressing room. This closet system was custom designed by California Closets, she informed Ellen, sliding open the doors to reveal an expansive walk-in space larger than some Manhattan apartments. The lighting, built-in jewelry safe, and cedar-lined sections were all premium upgrades. It's very impressive, Ellen acknowledged, making notes. I caught Melanie's eye, and she rolled hers subtly. We both knew the closet renovation had cost nearly $30,000, one of the many essential upgrades that had contributed to their financial strain. The assessment continued downstairs to the recently renovated kitchen with its professional grade. Appliances and imported Italian marble countertops, another budget-straining necessity that Diane had insisted upon. You'll note that all the cabinetry is custom, not prefabricated, she emphasized to Ellen. The difference in quality is substantial and should be reflected in your valuation. I document all features according to industry standards, Ellen assured her, diplomatically not commenting on whether such premium features actually returned their investment value in the current market. Throughout the tour, I maintained a professional distance, asking only occasional clarifying questions about systems or structural elements. Diane watched me like a hawk, clearly suspicious of my motives but unable to find any concrete objection to my presence. As we reached the finished basement, converted into a home theater and wine cellar during one of the later renovation phases, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. Meeting with Patricia finished. How's the assessment going? I typed back quickly. In progress. Diane here but cooperating minimally. His response came immediately. On my way. Be there in 20. I debated, warning Diane about his impending arrival, but decided against it. Surprise might actually work in our favor, preventing her from preparing another confrontational stance. The assessment was nearly complete when we heard the front door open upstairs. Diane stiffened, instantly alert to the intrusion. When my father's voice called out, "Hello? Ellen? Marshall?" her expression shifted from surprise to cold fury. "Excuse me," she said to Ellen with forced politeness. "I need to address this unexpected visitor." As she ascended the stairs, Melanie gave me a worried look. This could get ugly. That's why we're here, I reminded her. Witnesses tend to moderate behavior. We followed Diane upstairs to find my father standing in the foyer, dressed in business casual attire that somehow made him look more approachable than his usual formal suits. The contrast between his relaxed posture and Diane's rigid stance was striking. "Thomas," she greeted him icily, "I wasn't aware you'd be joining this ambush." "Not an ambush, Diane," he replied calmly. "A scheduled property assessment that I had. My attorney informed yours about yesterday." "Interesting timing, arriving just as it's concluding. Almost as if you were avoiding me." Her tone was accusatory. "I had a meeting with Patricia that ran long. Financial disclosure review." His gaze shifted to include Melanie and me. "Everything going okay here?" "Just peachy," Diane answered before either of us could respond. Your son has been thoroughly documenting all my decorating choices. Planning to claim my aesthetic improvements increased the property value, I presume. My father sighed. The assessment is to determine fair market value, Diane. Nothing more sinister than that. Ellen emerged from the basement, sensing the tension but maintaining her professional demeanor. I've completed my interior assessment. Just need some exterior measurements and photos, then I'll be out of your way. Thank you, Ellen, my father said. Feel free to access any areas of the property you need. As the assessor slipped past us, toward the backyard, Diane's facade of control finally fractured. You think you're so clever, don't you? All three of you conspiring behind my back. Planning how to strip me of my home, my security, everything I've built over 12 years of marriage. No one is conspiring against you, my father said wearily. We're following standard legal procedures for a separation. A separation I never agreed to. Her voice rose sharply. That you announced unilaterally after being manipulated by your precious son. Melanie stepped forward, placing herself slightly between them. Mom, that's not fair. Dad made his own decision. Diane rounded on her. And you, my own daughter, taking their side. After everything I've done for you. I'm not taking sides, Melanie insisted. I'm just trying to help everyone get through this without more drama than necessary. By accompanying them on their assessment of my home? By moving out and staying with them? Diane laughed bitterly. Don't insult my intelligence. You've chosen your side very clearly. I frowned. Moving out? Melanie hasn't. Not yet. Diane cut me off. But she will. She's already packed a suitcase. I saw it in her closet when I went to borrow a sweater this morning. Melanie flushed. You were snooping in my room? It's my house. Every room in it belongs to me. Legally incorrect, my father interjected quietly. And monitoring Melanie's private space is inappropriate, regardless of whose name is on the mortgage. Diane ignored him, her attention still fixed on her daughter. So, is it true? Are you planning to abandon me too? The naked vulnerability beneath the accusatory tone was jarring, a glimpse of the genuine fear driving Diane's increasingly desperate actions. Melanie hesitated, clearly torn between honesty and compassion. I'm not abandoning you, Mom, but I need some space from the conflict. You gave me an ultimatum this morning. A test of loyalty, Diane corrected. Which you're obviously failing. That's not fair, my father objected. You can't force Melanie to choose between her parents. Parents? Diane's voice rose again. I am her parent. You're just her stepfather, a distinction you've been very clear about making with Marshall for years. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. My father had never differentiated between his biological and step relationships. That had been Diane's consistent approach, creating subtle hierarchies that positioned me as the outsider while Melanie was real family. Before anyone could respond to this latest salvo, Ellen reappeared at the patio doors, either oblivious to or professionally ignoring the tension vibrating through the room. I've completed my assessment, she announced briskly. I'll have the report ready within 48 hours, as requested. Is there anything else you need from me today? My father cleared his throat, visibly gathering his composure. No, that's all. Thank you for your thoroughness, Ellen. As my father walked the assessor to the door, Diane turned to Melanie and me, her voice dropping to ensure he couldn't hear. This isn't over, not by a long shot. You think you've won because you have Thomas temporarily under your influence, but he'll come to his senses. He always does. The confidence in her statement might have been more convincing if not for the slight tremor in her hands, a physical manifestation of the uncertainty she was working so hard to conceal. This isn't about winning or losing, I replied quietly. It's about everyone moving forward in healthier ways. Her expression hardened. Such sanctimony from someone who manipulated financial systems to interfere in a marriage. Tell me, Marshall, Have you explained to Melanie exactly how you came up with $500,000 on a portfolio manager's salary? The real source of that money? The insinuation caught me off guard. What are you implying? Only that perhaps Bradford Mills isn't the only one who should be investigating the origins of those funds. Her smile was sharp-edged. Some might find the timing of certain investment returns suspicious. Before I could respond to this new accusation, my father returned, his expression making it clear he'd overheard at least part of the exchange. That's enough, Diane, he said firmly. Unfounded allegations won't strengthen your position. Unfounded? She laughed. I've been doing some investigation of my own. Your son's miraculous financial success might not hold up to serious scrutiny. A chill ran through me. What exactly had she discovered? My investment record was impeccable. But like any successful financial professional, I had positions that, taken out of context or misrepresented, could appear questionable to those looking for problems. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. We're leaving now. Melanie, are you coming with us or staying? Diane's attention snapped to her daughter, the implicit choice hanging in the air between them. Melanie took a deep breath, her decision evident in her straightened shoulders. I'm coming with you. Just let me grab some things first. As she headed upstairs, Diane called after her. If you walk out that door with them, don't expect to be welcomed back. Melanie paused on the stairs, turning back with a sad smile. Mom, that's exactly the kind of ultimatum that's pushing everyone away from you. The truth of the statement hung in the air as she disappeared upstairs, leaving Diane momentarily speechless, a rare occurrence that might have been satisfying under different circumstances. In the heavy silence that followed, I studied this woman who had spent years subtly undermining my place in my father's life. Despite everything, I found myself wondering what experiences had shaped her into someone so desperately controlling, so afraid of losing her position that she would sacrifice authentic connections to maintain it. For what it's worth, I said, finally. None of this was intended to hurt you. She met my gaze with cold certainty. But it has. And I promise you, Marshall, before this is over, you'll understand exactly how it feels to have everything you've built threatened by forces beyond your control. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the absolute conviction behind them that sent another chill through me. Diane wasn't making empty threats. She was making a promise. One that, given her demonstrated willingness to target my professional reputation, I couldn't afford to dismiss. As Melanie returned with a hastily packed overnight bag, I wondered what new complications awaited us, and what investigation Diane had been conducting into my financial affairs. 3 weeks after the property assessment, life had settled into an unexpected new pattern. My spacious penthouse, once a solitary retreat, now housed 3 Anderson Fisher family members. My father had established a makeshift office in one corner of the living room. Melanie had transformed the pull-out sofa into a surprisingly homey bedroom space with a few carefully chosen personal items. Temporary accommodations had evolved into something that felt increasingly permanent and strangely comfortable. Family meeting at 7, my father announced one evening as I arrived home from work. The phrase, once Diane's weapon of choice for orchestrating confrontations, had been reclaimed as something positive. Our nightly check-ins over dinner. I'll order Thai, Melanie called from the kitchen where she was sorting mail. The usual? I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, smiling at how quickly we'd established usuals and rhythms. Perfect. Any updates from the legal front today? My father looked up from his laptop, removing his reading glasses. Patricia called. Diane's attorney finally responded to our settlement proposal. The sudden tension in his voice caught my attention. And? She's rejected the house purchase offer. Completely. Won't even consider it as an option. I set my briefcase down, processing this development. That's not entirely unexpected. Diane's emotional attachment to the house has always been significant. It's not just that, my father continued. She's made a counter-proposal that's quite unusual. She wants to keep the house, obviously, but she's offering to waive any claim to my business assets in exchange. Melanie frowned. That doesn't make sense. The house's value is nowhere near the business valuation, even with the recent financial struggles. Exactly, my father agreed. Patricia thinks it's a deliberate lowball to extend negotiations. A delay tactic. I settled into an armchair, loosening my tie. Any word on what Bradford Mills found in his investigation? Nothing yet, though Andrew seems confident the external review will supersede whatever conclusions Mills reaches. The relative quiet of the past weeks had been deceptive. While we'd established a peaceful new household routine, multiple processes continued in the background. The separation negotiations, the compliance investigation at Berenson Capital, and whatever investigation Diane had alluded to regarding my finances. That last unknown troubled me most. Despite Andrew's assurances that my financial affairs were beyond reproach, Diane's confidence had suggested she believed she'd found something significant, something worth leveraging. You're worried, my father observed, studying my expression. Cautious, I corrected. Diane doesn't make empty threats. Melanie closed the mail sorting tray with more force than necessary. She's bluffing. She always does this. Acts like she has some trump card to create anxiety and uncertainty. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But we should stay vigilant. The doorbell interrupted our discussion. None of us was expecting visitors, and security hadn't called up to announce anyone. Slightly wary after Diane's previous surprise appearances, I checked the peephole before opening the door. James Berenson stood in the hallway, his expression uncharacteristically somber. James, I said, surprised. This is unexpected. Marshall. He nodded. May I come in? There's a matter we need to discuss. I stepped aside, gesturing him in. Of course. This is my father, Thomas Anderson, and my stepsister, Melanie Fisher. James acknowledged them with a brief nod before turning back to me. Is there somewhere we can speak privately? The formal request, so unlike James's usual direct approach, sent a wave of unease through me. We can use my home office. Once inside with the door closed, James declined my offer of a seat, remaining standing by the window. I received a call today, he began without preamble. From Diane Fisher, your stepmother. I tensed, preparing for the worst. What did she want? To share what she called concerning information about your investment activities. He paused, studying my reaction. Specifically, she referenced your early position in cytogenics pharmaceuticals. The reference hit like a physical blow. Cytogenics had been my most successful investment, a small biotech firm I'd discovered 4 years ago and invested in heavily before their breakthrough cancer treatment received FDA approval. The stock had surged nearly 800% following the announcement, forming the foundation of my personal wealth. What about cytogenics? I asked carefully. She suggested you had advanced knowledge of the FDA approval, that your investment timing was suspiciously prescient. The accusation was as serious as it was baseless. Insider trading, if proven, would not only end my career, but could result in criminal charges. That's categorically false, I stated firmly. My cytogenics investment was based on publicly available research and standard due diligence. I have complete documentation of my investment rationale. James nodded, unsurprised. That's what I told her. I also mentioned that our firm conducted a thorough review of all your personal investments when you were promoted to senior portfolio manager 2 years ago, standard procedure for anyone handling client assets at your level. Relief washed through me. Thank you for that. Don't thank me for stating facts, he replied evenly. What concerns me is not the accusation itself, which is clearly without merit, but the timing and motivation behind it. My stepmother is desperate to regain leverage in my father's separation proceedings, I explained. She's targeting my professional reputation as a pressure point. James's expression remained neutral. She mentioned that your payment of their debts came shortly after the cytogenic stock reached its peak value. Because that's when I had sufficient liquid assets to help them, I countered. The timing was determined by my awareness of their financial distress, not any impropriety with the original investment. He nodded again, seemingly satisfied. I assumed as much. However, her call raises a procedural obligation for me to disclose this conversation to our compliance department. My stomach tightened, which is currently conducting an investigation prompted by her previous accusations. Precisely, with Bradford Mills leading that review, who, I understand, has a personal connection to your stepmother. They attended college together, I confirmed, and have maintained social contact during the investigation. James frowned at this. That represents a clear conflict of interest that should have been disclosed. My attorney has already requested an independent external review on those grounds. Good. James finally moved from his position by the window, his posture relaxing slightly. I came here personally rather than calling because I wanted to gauge your reaction directly. Your response confirms my assessment of the situation, which is that your stepmother is engaged in a calculated attempt to undermine your professional standing for personal leverage. He checked his watch. I have a dinner engagement, so I'll be brief. The external review of your anonymous gift to your father will proceed as planned, superseding Mills's internal investigation. Regarding this new cytogenics allegation, I'll instruct our legal team to prepare a formal cease and desist letter to Mrs. Fisher, warning that further unfounded accusations against a Berenson employee could result in legal action. The directness of his support left me momentarily speechless. Thank you, James. He waved this away. Don't mistake this for personal favoritism, Marshall. This is about protecting Berenson Capital from being manipulated as a pawn in a family dispute. After James departed, I returned to the living room to find my father and Melanie waiting expectantly. Mom called your boss? Melanie guessed, reading my expression. I nodded, sinking onto the sofa. Accused me of insider trading, specifically regarding my cytogenics investment. My father's face darkened. That's beyond inappropriate. It's potentially defamatory. James is handling it, I assured him. But it confirms what we suspected. Diane has been investigating my financial history, looking for pressure points. She must be truly desperate, Melanie observed. Attacking your professional reputation is a nuclear option. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Not Diane's regular number or her private line, but the message was unmistakably from her. Hope you enjoyed your visit from James Berenson. That was just a taste of what I can do. Meet me tomorrow, 2 p.m. at Westside Provisions. Come alone or things get much worse. I showed the message to my father and Melanie. You can't go, my father said immediately. It's clearly a trap. If I don't, she'll just escalate further, I pointed out. At least this way I can gauge what she's really after. I'm coming with you, Melanie insisted. I shook my head. No. She specifically said to come alone, and I don't want to provoke her further. Then I'll stay out of sight, she countered, but I'm not letting you face her solo after these threats. The next day, I arrived at Westside Provisions District, an upscale shopping and dining complex, precisely at 2 p.m. Diane had chosen a public location, presumably to prevent any dramatic confrontation. I spotted her at a corner table at the artisanal coffee shop, looking perfectly composed in a designer dress and pearls. You came alone. Good. She gestured to the seat across from her. Coffee? Let's skip the pleasantries, I said, remaining standing. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with these allegations against me? You know they're baseless? Are they? She raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. Your cytogenics investment timing was remarkably fortunate. The same month they received FDA approval, as I recall. The same month they announced FDA approval, I corrected. A matter of public record. My investment was made 8 months earlier, based on published clinical trial results available to any investor willing to do their research. She sipped her coffee, unnervingly calm. Perhaps. But perception matters in your industry, doesn't it? Even the suggestion of impropriety can damage a reputation. Is that your play? Threaten my professional standing unless I… What? Convince my father to return to a marriage he's clearly decided to end? Not quite so dramatic. She set down her cup precisely. I want the house. Not just temporarily, but permanently. And I want a significantly more generous financial settlement than Thomas has offered. Those are matters for your respective attorneys to negotiate. But you have influence with Thomas now, she pointed out. More than I do, apparently. And you have the financial means to ensure he doesn't feel pressured to shortchange me in order to protect his own future. The calculation behind her strategy was becoming clear. So you're threatening my career unless I financially subsidize your settlement. I prefer to think of it as recognizing our mutual interests. You want these unpleasant accusations to disappear. I want financial security. Surely we can find a solution that achieves both. I finally sat down, studying her with new understanding. Beneath the manipulative tactics and threats was something unexpectedly human. Fear. Diane was terrified of losing the life and status she'd built over 12 years of marriage. Why not just accept my offer to purchase the house at market value? I asked. You'd receive half the proceeds, enough for a substantial down payment on a new property. Because that house represents everything I've accomplished, she replied, an edge of genuine emotion breaking through her composed facade. Every detail, every renovation reflects my vision, my taste, my social standing. It's the tangible evidence of the life I've built. A life built on financial quicksand, I pointed out. The renovations, the entertaining, the image maintenance, it all contributed to the debt that nearly collapsed around you. Her expression hardened. Don't lecture me about financial management when you've never had to maintain the social connections essential to Thomas's business success. Those renovations, those dinner parties, they created the environment where deals happen, where relationships are cultivated. There was a kernel of truth there I hadn't previously acknowledged. While Diane's spending had been excessive, her social orchestration had indeed supported my father's consulting practice over the years. I understand that your contributions weren't purely decorative, I conceded, but threatening my professional reputation won't get you what you want, won't it? Her smile was tight. I may not be able to prove insider trading, but I can certainly create enough smoke to prompt a more thorough investigation. The scrutiny alone would be disruptive. James, Berenson is preparing a cease and desist letter as we speak, I informed her. Any further allegations will be met with legal action. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her features. You're bluffing. I'm not. Your call to James yesterday crossed a line, Diane. There are boundaries even in bitter family disputes. She absorbed this, recalculating her position. What are you offering, then? Nothing involving blackmail or threats, I said firmly. But I am willing to modify my house purchase proposal to give you more favorable terms. A 15% premium above market value, with an option for you to rent it back for up to a year while you find a new property. Her eyes narrowed, assessing the offer. Why would you do that if not out of fear of my accusations? Because despite everything, you're Melanie's mother and were my father's wife for 12 years. Because ending this conflict benefits everyone. And because I recognize that your identity has become entangled with that house in ways that make separation more complex than just dividing assets. She studied me for a long moment, perhaps searching for hidden motives or manipulation. The rental option is interesting, but a 15% premium isn't sufficient. 20%, I countered. Final offer, with the premium applying only if you agree to cease all accusations and allow the separation to proceed without further obstruction. And you'll encourage Thomas to be more generous regarding alimony? I'll encourage him to be fair, recognizing your contributions to his business success over the years. That's all I can promise. She considered this, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. What about Melanie? What about her? She's living with you now. A hint of vulnerability crept into her voice. She won't even take my calls. That's between you and her, I said gently. I won't use her as a negotiating point. Diane looked away, blinking rapidly. I never expected her to choose your side. She hasn't chosen sides. She's removed herself from an impossible situation where you demanded absolute loyalty. I'm her mother, she said quietly. I deserved her loyalty. You deserved her love, which you've always had. Loyalty under duress isn't loyalty, it's compliance. The distinction seemed to land with unexpected impact. Diane sat back, momentarily stripped of her usual defenses. I need to think about your offer, she finally said. Take 24 hours, I replied, standing to leave. But understand this, Diane. Regardless of your decision, the attacks on my professional reputation end today. That's non-negotiable. As I turned to go, she called after me. Marshall, I paused, looking back. Why did you do it? Pay off our debts anonymously? You could have left Thomas to face the consequences of his financial mismanagement. The question seemed genuine rather than accusatory for once. Because he's my father, I answered simply. And because no one deserves to lose everything they've built because of poor financial decisions, even decisions influenced by someone else's expectations. I saw something shift in her expression, not quite gratitude or remorse, but perhaps the first glimmer of genuine understanding. 1 month later, I stood in the backyard of the house that had once been my childhood home and later Diane's showcase property. Now it was officially mine, purchased at market value plus 20%, with Diane renting it back for 6 months while she looked for a new place. The separation agreement had been finalized with surprising efficiency once Diane accepted the modified house arrangement. My father had indeed been fair regarding alimony, acknowledging Diane's contributions to his business success over the years. The process wasn't without tension, but it proceeded without further personal attacks or professional threats. Penny for your thoughts, my father said, joining me on the patio where I'd stepped out for a moment of quiet reflection during the small gathering inside. Just thinking about how much has changed in a few months, I replied. I never imagined I'd own this place. He nodded, surveying the manicured lawn that had been his weekend project during my childhood years. Your investment is sound. This neighborhood has appreciated consistently for decades. It wasn't just a financial decision, I admitted. This house, before all the renovations and status upgrades, was where we were a family. It holds memories. My father's expression softened. Good ones, I hope, despite everything that came after. Many good ones, I assured him. That's partly why I couldn't bear the thought of strangers buying it. Inside, Melanie was helping Diane serve coffee and dessert to a small group including Patricia Chen, Andrew Kellman, and surprisingly, James Berenson, who had taken an unexpected interest in our family situation. The gathering, a civilized closure ceremony suggested by Patricia, marked the official transition to our new family configuration. Remarkably, Diane had embraced the concept, perhaps recognizing the value of a dignified conclusion rather than a bitter, drawn-out battle. Her rental arrangement gave her time to find a new property while maintaining her social standing. No hasty downsizing or public acknowledgement of financial distress. More significantly, her relationship with Melanie had begun a cautious repair process. Once the ultimatums and loyalty demands ceased, Melanie had gradually renewed contact, setting clear boundaries, but leaving room for reconciliation. She's Different, my father observed, following my gaze to where Diane was actually laughing at something James had said. Less defensive, more authentic somehow. Sometimes losing what you've been desperately clinging to becomes liberating, I suggested. She no longer has to maintain the fiction of perfect marital harmony or financial stability. He nodded thoughtfully. I should have been more honest years ago about our finances, about her behavior toward you. The debt you paid was as much moral as financial. We all contributed to the situation, I acknowledged. I could have tried harder to navigate the relationship with Diane instead of retreating into practiced politeness. You were the child in that equation, he reminded me. The responsibility was ours, not yours. Inside, Melanie caught my eye through the window and gestured for us to rejoin the group. As we moved toward the house, my father paused. Thank you, he said quietly. Not just for the financial intervention, but for pushing us all toward honesty. It was long overdue. In the dining room, Diane was distributing small plates of cheesecake, her specialty that she'd insisted on making for the occasion, despite its technical inappropriateness for a separation celebration. Marshall, Thomas, you're missing James's story about the client who tried to pay his management fees in rare coins, she called, her tone cordial, if not entirely warm. As we rejoined the group, I noticed how seamlessly my father and I were incorporated into the conversation. No subtle exclusions or redirections, none of Diane's usual conversational tactics that had marginalized me at countless family gatherings over the years. Before we finish, Diane said, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate care, I'd like to say something. The table quieted, attention turning to her. This wasn't part of the planned proceedings. Recent months have been challenging for all of us, she began, her voice steadier than I'd expected. The separation, the financial revelations, the necessary restructuring of our family relationships. None of it has been easy. She paused, glancing around the table before her gaze settled on me. I particularly owe Marshall an acknowledgement. My behavior toward you has been consistently unfair from the beginning of my relationship with your father and especially during this separation process. The accusations I made, both to your face and behind your back, were unjustified and, I now recognize, harmful. The admission, delivered without Diane's usual qualifiers or deflections, left the table momentarily speechless. My father reached over to squeeze my shoulder, a gesture of support and perhaps surprise at this unexpected development. Thank you for saying that, I replied simply, recognizing the courage it must have taken. She nodded, a complex emotion crossing her features. I've spent weeks working with a therapist, at Patricia's suggestion, to understand my own behavior patterns. My need for control, my fear of being displaced in Thomas's affections, my insecurity about my place in this family. None of it excuses how I treated you, but perhaps it explains some of it. This glimpse of self-awareness from Diane was more meaningful than any formal apology could have been. Not a complete transformation, those rarely happen overnight, but a significant step towards something healthier. To new beginnings, James offered, raising his coffee cup in a toast that elegantly navigated the emotional moment. And honest endings, Patricia added with a nod to both my father and Diane. As coffee cups clinked gently around the table, I caught Melanie's eye. Her small smile conveyed volumes: relief, cautious optimism, acknowledgement of how far we'd all come from that Thanksgiving dinner, when Diane had called me ungrateful, not knowing I'd paid their debt. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. What had begun as an anonymous financial rescue had catalyzed the collapse of a marital facade, the revelation of long-buried family dynamics, and ultimately, a path toward more authentic relationships for everyone involved. The house would eventually sell again, perhaps in a year or two when Diane had established her new life elsewhere. My father and I would continue rebuilding our relationship, making up for lost time without the manipulative interference that had kept us at arm's length for years. Melanie would maintain connections with all parties, no longer forced to navigate impossible loyalty tests. And Diane? Her journey seemed the most uncertain but potentially the most transformative. Stripped of the financial pretense and marital identity that had defined her for over a decade, she had the opportunity to discover who she might become when not constrained by appearances and expectations. As the afternoon light filtered through the dining room windows I now technically owned, I reflected on how differently this family drama had concluded than anyone might have predicted. Not with bitter court battles or permanent estrangements, but with coffee and cheesecake in a house filled with complicated history and unexpected new beginnings. Sometimes, it seems, the most valuable things purchased with money aren't material possessions but the catalysts for necessary change, even when that change arrives through conflict, revelation, and painful honesty. And sometimes being called ungrateful is merely the first step toward a gratitude more genuine than politeness. Could ever manufacture. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.